everyone. We have already discussed lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth, and today we'll take up the Prelude as well as some other notable poems by the poet in order to understand his contribution to English literature. The Prelude is a long autobiographical poem which Wordsworth started writing in 1798 and he completed it in 1805. The book was published after his death in 1850. It is written in blank verse and is in 14 books. It is a psychological account of the growth of his mind, and here he narrates his personal experiences. The book highlights his belief in nature as a source of beauty, peace, and inspiration. The subject of the prelude was the poet's development from his childhood to maturity, and the theme was a love of nature and its importance in his life. So, Wordsworth here talks about his connection, disconnection, and then reconnection with nature. The role that the nature played at various stages in his life is described in the prelude. Wordsworth's early years were spent among the hills and beside the river Derwent. Wordsworth enjoyed the beauty of the river and the lakes as a boy. The beginning of the book describes the early childhood feelings and impressions. The joy that the poet derived from the rich natural scene around him is described in the prelude. So, the early association with natural objects developed in him a calmness which became a characteristic feature in his later years. This was then followed by a period of the visionary experience when Wordsworth fell in love with nature passionately without any intellectual interest. This was the stage of great happiness and joy, but it came to an end with his experience of human sorrow and suffering in France. The love and illusion for the French Revolution is explained here, and Wordsworth heard the still sad music of humanity, and his love of nature was linked with the love of man. He found beauty in the character of the humble people, and he bent in reverence to nature and to men as they are men within themselves. After this came the stage when the poet's love of nature became reflective, mystical, and spiritual. Wordsworth felt in nature a presence that disturbed him with the joy of elevated thoughts. He expresses, quote, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of men. So Wordsworth felt that there is one soul through the universe, but it objectifies itself into various forms and phenomena perceived by the senses. So this was the greatest period of Wordsworth's poetic life. So, to understand how the poet views nature's awesome powers, the book plays a very important role. It states the poet's belief in nature as a living being, as a teacher, as a nurse, as a divine. So the prelude, it lays before us the distinctive qualities of the poet as an individual. The prelude then is an extremely personal work, and it reveals many details of Wordsworth's life. It helps us understand Wordsworth's poetry and his philosophy of nature. The critic Herbert Reed rightly points out, quote, "The prelude undoubtedly places before us Wordsworth the revolutionary, Wordsworth the man, Wordsworth the poet, and finally Wordsworth the high priest of nature." Unquote. Thus, the prelude is valuable because it describes the creation of a poet, of the one who was pivotal in English literature. Besides these two important works, Wordsworth wrote a number of poems which are noteworthy, and we will take a look at few of his popular poems. The first one, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, which Wordsworth started writing in 1802 and he completed it in 1806. It was published in two volumes in 1807, and it is Wordsworth's greatest ode, which glorifies childhood. The subject matter here is the immortality of the soul, and the poem explores the narrator's divine relationship with nature, which is lost as the child grows and loses his divine vision. So, according to the poet, the human being is aware about the immortality of the soul in the childhood. Wordsworth emphasizes on this point that a child is able to see a divine spark in all the things around him, even in the common objects. But this divine spark is seen only as long as he is a child. As he grows up, the society corrupts him, and the divine spark cannot be seen. So Wordsworth states that innocence is replaced by philosophical thought when one grows up. Wordsworth here calls the child a philosopher, an eye among the blind, a mighty prophet, a seer. So this is one of the most celebrated ode of Wordsworth, and Emerson praises the poem. He states that the poem is it is the high watermark of poetry in the 19th century. Tintern Abbey, another very popular poem by Wordsworth, and the full title of the poem goes as "Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour, July 13, 1798." So the poem was written on July 13, 1798, and it was published in the same year. It is a conversational poem which is written in the form of a monologue. The poet addresses himself, the spirit of nature, and sometimes his sister. Dorothy. So the poem, it is written in blank verse, and the poet here talks about the development of his relationship with nature. He describes the four stages. The first one being his experience as a child when he was fascinated by the outward beauty of nature. Second was the stage when he found meaning in nature. And the third stage when nature started giving a philosophical message. And the final stage of pantheism when man, nature, and God becomes one. Now, the poem is the most appropriate to understand the poet's philosophy on nature and its beauty. The Solitary Reaper, which established Wordsworth as a true romantic poet, was published in 1807, and it is in the form of a ballad. It draws from the simple rustic life, and Wordsworth is enchanted with the melancholic song of a young girl who is reaping in the field. So here, nature is felt as a source of peace and happiness. The theme of loneliness and isolation from the worldly matters, as well as the theme of the lasting effect of natural surrounding. The poem is written in simple language, and by placing the praise and the beauty in a rustic natural setting, and by establishing as its source a simple rustic girl, Wordsworth acts on the purpose of the lyrical ballads. The poem is a true representation of the romantic qualities. The poem Daffodils was written in 1804 and published in 1815. It is in the form of a lyric. Wordsworth once was on a walk with his sister and he came across a belt of daffodils. Now, this wonderful sight inspired him to write this remarkable poem. The poem expresses Wordsworth's deep love for nature. The diction is simple. He writes, quote, or oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Unquote. So the mere memory of the sight of daffodils would lift the poet's spirit whenever he felt dejected or depressed. The poem is an eulogy to the restorative power of nature. Wordsworth believed that nature has the healing power. Composed upon Westminster Bridge, another poem by Wordsworth, which was written in 1802. The poem is a sonnet, a Petrarchan sonnet, which consists of 14 divided into an octave and a sestet. Now, in this poem, Wordsworth depicts the beauty of London in the early morning light, and he admires the early morning calmness of the city standing on the Westminster Bridge. So here Wordsworth takes London, the city, as his subject, and he treats it with romantic flavor. Therefore, when we talk about the theme of the poem, then it comes out to be that the cities can inspire similar feelings of calm so deep as a countryside does. So, these poems of Wordsworth reveal that he was a true romantic. The poems contain a number of romantic characteristics. Wordsworth wrote about 387 poems, and his poems are worth reading. Certainly, it can be said that Wordsworth was a true romantic poet.